Okay.
Yeah. People are jumping in.
It looks like, oh, there we
People
go.
are coming.
Great.
The cat? Meow.
Yes, that's my cat.
Where? Where's the
Ginger.
cat? Oh.
She's over there on the sofa.
I think everyone's here. There's like 19 of us.
Okay. So, Fernanda, you want to welcome folks?
Yeah. Então, vamos começar, pessoal. Boa noite para todo mundo. Sejam muito bem-vindas, muito bem-vindos. Hoje a gente vai conversar com o Loizzo sobre psicoterapia contemplativa e compaixão. E esse é o último, né, assim, de uma série de 6 diálogos contemplativos que a gente tem feito desde o ano passado, trazendo professores nossos, né, do curso na Holanda de psicoterapia contemplativa e outros convidados também, com a intenção de fomentar esse campo da psicoterapia contemplativa aqui no Brasil, né? Tem pouquíssimo material em português, né? Pouquíssimo conhecimento ainda sendo produzido em português. E nós, como estudantes, né, do Instituto na Holanda, a gente sentiu essa necessidade, né, como estudantes e como psicólogos, né, vendo o interesse das pessoas de promover esse trabalho, de trazer para o português um pouco desses conhecimentos, né? E essa fala vai ser traduzida, né? Então, se vocês estiverem no computador, embaixo na tela de vocês vai ter o globinho, e aí vocês podem escolher português, ou se estiverem no celular, vocês podem clicar no mais, aqui no canto direito, e vai aparecer também interpretação de idiomas, e aí vocês podem escolher o português, tá bom? E aí também, qualquer dúvida que vocês tiverem, a gente está aqui, né, no chat, respondendo vocês. Qualquer problema, vocês podem procurar a gente, tá? As perguntas, elas vão ser feitas no final, né? O Joey vai falar por 1 hora e a gente vai ter meia horinha de perguntas. Quero agradecer muitíssimo a Yara, né, e a Doris, que são as nossas tradutoras, que estão fazendo esse trabalho sempre muito, muito incrível, com muita dedicação, com muito amor para a gente. A Yara também é estudante, né, do Nalanda, e a Doris já está com a gente há um tempo também, apoiando esse trabalho. Muito obrigada a vocês. Eu sou Fernanda, sou psicóloga, sou de São Paulo. O Ale, que está aqui também. Você quer dar um oizinho, Ale? Que é
Olá, boa
psicólogo, também
noite.
faz parte.
Muito obrigado pela presença de todos.
Isso. A gente está aqui com a Mar também, né? Quer dar um oi, Mar? Só para o pessoal te conhecer. A Mar, ela faz parte do Instituto Nalanda também, né? Ela é pintora, educadora e professora de yoga, né? E é co-diretora do curso de psicoterapia contemplativa do Instituto Nalanda. E é quem nos dá apoio, né? A Mar é a pessoa que responde os e-mails, que dá todo o suporte para os alunos, né? Tanto do espanhol quanto do português. E foi quem, nesse último ano, né, que a gente teve um número grande de estudantes aí em português e fizemos um esforço de traduções, né? Que teve aí sempre nos apoiando e nos dando um super apoio, um super suporte, para que a gente pudesse levar esse curso em 3 línguas, né? Inglês, espanhol e português. Então, ela está aqui com a gente também para responder qualquer dúvida que vocês tiverem sobre o programa. E vou apresentar o Joey. Loizzo, ele é psiquiatra, né? Estudioso budista formado na Universidade de Colômbia, com mais de 40 anos de experiência no estudo dos efeitos benéficos das práticas contemplativas, na cura, aprendizagem e desenvolvimento. Ele é professor assistente de psiquiatria clínica e medicina integrativa do Weill Cornell Medical College e professor adjunto no Centro de Estudos Budistas da Universidade de Colômbia. Loizzo, ele vive em Manhattan com sua esposa e seus filhos, e ele é fundador e diretor acadêmico do Instituto Nalanda. E eu esqueci de falar que a Mar também vive em Nova York, né, no Brooklyn, com o seu marido e com a sua cachorrinha Tara. Né? Então, sejam todos muito bem-vindos e vamos aproveitar esse momento especial.
Obrigado, Fernanda e Ale. I will speak in English since my Portuguese is only 2 words or 1 word. So the translator is working now. Everyone can hear the translation in Portuguese. Yes? Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. So I'm so happy to be joining you all today. And actually, here in New York City, it's the middle of summer. And so it's very hot, in case I start dripping. And I understand you're in the middle of winter. So that's the earth we live on. But unfortunately, one of the things we share is that we're all struggling with, we've been struggling with COVID for over a year. And I understand things are very dire in Brazil. So our hearts go out to you. And some of you may have been sick yourself or have lost people or lost work. And we just understand this is a very difficult time. And also that I understand there's a lot of political unrest as well. So it's this kind of time when we really need deeper practice. We need profound methods of helping to calm our minds and protect our minds and bodies from all the stresses. And so a lot of people have been interested in our programs at Nalanda Institute, which I will explain. I'll try to orient you to so that you understand kind of how we're trying to make a difference. Essentially, I'll just say a few words about myself. As a young man, I grew up the son of a psychiatrist. So sometimes I say that my profession is an inherited condition. But one of the things I noticed about my father as I saw him become more successful is that he became more and more stressed and eventually really burnt out in his profession. So I had a kind of my own little homespun or household double-blind experiment because my mother took a very different path in life. She was a teacher. She was an immigrant from Sicily, and she was very devoted to spirituality. And what I noticed is that over the years, she got more peaceful and more happy, while my father, who was very interested in science and medicine, got more stressed and more burnt out. So I decided that it was important to try to understand how to bring contemplative living or spiritual practice and wisdom into the work of healing, both obviously for our patients or clients who need these kinds of skills, but also very much for ourselves as we are at on the front lines trying to share and be present with the suffering of others at the same time as trying to be able to stay well and positive and see the possibilities that we all have for healing and transformation. So I became very interested when I went to college in the relationship between spirituality and psychology, and I discovered my first Buddhist teacher in college. I was very lucky to meet a Western scholar who had just been a Tibetan monk for a number of years. Actually, one of the first Western individuals or to become a Tibetan monk. His name is Robert Thurman, and that was way back in the 70s. So that was a very long time ago. You see, there's a lot of gray hair here, and at that time, very few people were interested in, you know, how mindfulness or meditation or these things, and especially in medicine. So I really, when I learned about Buddhism, I really felt like this was kind of the perfect bridge, because unlike the Christianity, Catholicism, I was raised Catholic, and unlike Catholicism, Buddhism was very interested in science, interested in psychology. But unlike modern science and psychology, Buddhism also had a spiritual foundation and really brought the importance of wisdom, of ethics, and of meditation in human well-being, healing, and so on. So the Buddhist psychology seemed to me like the perfect bridge between, if you want to, in terms of my life, in terms of the path that my father took, the path into science and medicine and psychology, and the path that my mother took, which was the path toward spirituality and teaching. Um, so I studied Buddhism very intensely in college and continued to study it even when I went to medical school. I went to India. I met some of the Dalai Lama's teachers, Serkong Rinpoche, Ling Rinpoche, and the Tibetan who would become my closest teacher, Gaelic Rinpoche, who's since passed away. But in my whole experience, of course, early in my time of studying how Buddhist psychology and contemplative practice could be integrated with Western psychology, healing, medicine. As I said, it wasn't very popular at the time, and I had to sort of keep it a secret. A lot of the people in medical school would get very worried when they found out what I was doing, because I went with the specific intent of bringing these two worlds together. And at that time, it seemed kind of crazy. In fact, I wondered whether I was crazy. But as it turned out over the years, other people had taken the same path, and we gradually found that there were more and more ways in which, contemplative practice, like things like mindfulness, could be helpful in healing in the hospital setting, and in physical healing, and also in mental healing. So, that was, in the 80s and 90s when I was in the laboratory at Harvard with Herbert Benson, studying the relaxation response and studying Tibetan yogis. And John Kabat-Zinn was busy developing mindfulness-based stress reduction a few hours away in Worcester, Massachusetts. So it was a time when, people were really starting to apply meditation to the world of health and well-being. And since that time, there's been a huge accumulating mountain of research showing that, surprise, surprise, that that these contemplative practices like mindfulness, compassion training, imagery, recitation, all these practices, which I'll talk to you briefly about this evening really worked to transform the brain and to promote health and well-being. And so gradually we developed this, what in the US people call the mindfulness revolution. I'm not sure to what extent the mindfulness revolution has reached Brazil, but I suppose I'm sure it has. It has. I see some hands. So let me just begin by talking briefly about the science and why it is. I think my camera's getting a little blurry, right? Okay, that may be better. To just explain some key points in science that really allowed this surprising confluence of Western neuroscience and medicine with Eastern meditation traditions and meditative healing. Um, you know, One of the things that we discovered in neuroscience in the late '90s was that what I had learned, which was the brain is is wired like an electrical circuit, right? Uh, that's actually not true, and that in fact the brain is plastic, and nerve cells are always growing depending on how we use them, right? Just like muscles, when we use our nerve cells in certain ways because we're attending to different things or experiencing different things, our brains are responding and learning through forming new connections with other nerves and forming new pathways that eventually allow us to learn and not just to learn on a mental or psychological level, but to learn on a brain level in a way that's really etched into the fabric of our being. So neuroplasticity was a big revolution in modern neuroscience, and it's actually something that gave psychotherapy a kind of new wind, right? After years or decades in which psychotherapy was challenged because the new neuroscience and the new medications that were coming out in the 80s, the 70s, 80s, 90s made it seem like talk therapy wasn't really so important anymore. And then one of the things we discovered in neuroplasticity was that actually that allowed us to understand the mechanism by which talk therapy actually does impact the brain just as powerfully as medications. In fact, in some ways, more powerfully, because the brain isn't just changing, but it's also learning. Well, a few years later, right? So at the end of the Eric Kandel, who actually was at Columbia doing his research, was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2000 for discovering neuroplasticity. And a few years later, Richie Davidson, in his lab at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, was studying a group of Tibetan meditators. And one of the things he found was that these Tibetan meditators could generate a very unusual kind of brainwave, something called a high frequency gamma brainwave. And what that meant to him, what it signified, because that high frequency gamma is thought of as sort of like the eureka brainwave. It's like the brainwave we have when we have a very flash of insight, a very powerful surprise learning moment. And usually it never really appears on an EEG because, flashes of insight don't happen that often, right? But it turned out that these meditators were having this high frequency gamma, not just one flash of it, but they were able to have it for minutes at a time. And they weren't just having, the high frequency gamma for minutes at a time, but it was spread over the whole front of the whole cortex, the whole neocortex. It wasn't just in one area. And the meditators could turn it on and off at will. So this study wound up to be the first study on meditation ever published in the American journal called the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is an extremely prestigious uh, journal. What that means is around that time, which was 2004, mindfulness and meditation, the research on meditation was coming together with the research on neuroplasticity. And what we were discovering was that meditation may be the most powerful way to accelerate and guide neuroplasticity that we've ever seen. And so this is really what, on a science level, started sealed the deal and started this new wave of, we call the mindfulness revolution. And since that time, of course, there have been thousands of studies that have shown that mindfulness-based techniques in psychotherapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, all these different therapies based on mindfulness actually prove to be very effective. So, this is kind of the basis for this whole new field. And so it turned out that, you know, I really had a huge surprise by the time I came, when I left New York to go to Harvard, to go to medical school, graduate school. Nobody was interested in meditation back in the 80s. Nobody was open to mindfulness. But when I came back in 1996, everything had completely changed. Meditation was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. There were yoga centers everywhere. And there's a huge interest in, and a huge scientific interest and a medical interest in how meditative practices can transform our minds, our brains, and promote well-being and healing. So I guess I wasn't crazy after all, right? And I started a center at New York Hospital and did some research and eventually started Nalanda Institute to help teach other therapists how to use these practices. Now, the one thing I would say is that the mindfulness revolution is based on a very, very small fraction of the science of meditative healing in the ancient Indian and Tibetan traditions, right? I would say actually that mindfulness, as most people know it today, is less than 10% of the full science of meditative healing and learning and transformation that was evolved over millennia, over thousands of years in India, and then got preserved in Tibet and other cultures in Asia. So one of the things I did was to really sort of try very early on to teach people more than just mindfulness, to teach people all the different forms of mindfulness, to teach people the psychology of loving kindness, of self-compassion, and then eventually the psychology of compassion, in order to really give people a fuller picture of the full potential of the confluence of contemplative practice with psychotherapy. So often when I talk about this, I like to say that in the evolution of contemplative science in India, there were three great waves of practice, right? So the first wave, way back in the Buddha's day, was based in mindfulness, based in what we call Abhidharma, that is Buddhist psychology. It was also happening around the time of basic yoga, hatha yoga. But after that, around the time of Christ, in India, there was a whole new form of psychology and meditative practice that was developing that was based on compassion. So I refer to that as the second wave of contemplative science and practice that happened in India around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era and spread through India over the next 5 or 6 centuries. Eventually, 5 or 6 centuries later, there was even a third wave. And that is when not only did people focus on mindfulness, which really impacts the mind, as you can imagine, not only did they focus on compassion, which really impacts the heart, but they started to focus on what we call embodied practices. And these are practices like visualization, recitation, or a kind of prayer or mantra. They're practices like intensive breathing and practices like gentle movement or self-massage. These embodied practices allow one to embody compassion at an even deeper level than the heart, really at the level of the gut and the older parts of the brain. So I talk about these three waves of contemplative science and practice. I also believe that these three waves can be overlap or specifically relate to transforming the three parts of the human brain, right? Transforming the neocortex, which is the new primate part of our brain, transforming the limbic system, which is the mammalian part where the heart feelings of love and compassion are, and even transforming the reptilian brain, which is what the embodied practices do. The embodied practices like imagery, mantra, breath, and movement impact these very old parts of the brain. So this is the reason why, because we're not just minds, we really mostly suffer at the level of our hearts, right? When we feel, say, in early development, when we don't feel safely connected to our caregiver, we develop attachment disorders, may develop attachment traumas. These early forms of emotional suffering really need an emotional cure. So compassion-based psychotherapy, compassion-based contemplative psychotherapy is extremely important. You can think of it as sort of like, in the West, we have cognitive therapy and then we have relational therapy, right? Or family therapy. So in the Indic world, in the contemplative psychology world, we have mindfulness-based psychotherapy, which is very similar to cognitive therapy or classical psychoanalysis. But we also have compassion-based therapy, which is much more similar to relational psychotherapy in the Western context, family systems theory. It's really about the heart, our relationships with others, and working with our emotions. And again, talking about the three waves, compassion isn't just something that we can experience at the level of the heart, it's also something that we can embody. And so in the third wave, we talk about our embodied contemplative practices and embodied psychotherapy. And it turns out that the compassion-based therapies and the embodied compassion therapies may be actually much more effective at dealing with the very early attachment traumas and even repressed traumas that affect the autonomic nervous system, these traumas that we are learning more and more about and seeing more and more in our clinical work. So that's just a basic overview, right? That this is at Nalanda Institute, we're trying to help people learn more than just simple mindfulness. We're trying to help them learn the whole psychology of healing and transformation that mindfulness is part of. And we're also trying to help them learn the second and third waves of contemplative healing and practice that are based on compassion training and are based on embodied compassion practices. So all of these are what we teach at Nalanda Institute, and we teach them in our 2-year contemplative psychotherapy program, right? That program essentially starts with a year focused on mindfulness and loving kindness and a little bit of self-compassion. And then the compassion year, which is the one that's coming up this fall, focuses on compassion training and learning how to warm the heart, to transform emotional trauma, and even tap into the unconscious embodied traumas that are the deepest forms of suffering that our clients experience. So, yeah, so that's a little overview. Um, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about compassion since that's the year coming up. But also, if anyone already has some questions, I mean, please, if there are questions on your mind, please, we're a small group, so you can feel free to raise your hand or send them in the chat to Mar or Fernanda. And I'd be happy to start addressing your questions now if you like. But I'm also happy to keep giving you a little bit more of a flavor for compassion research and the state of that research. So you let me know. Anybody have any questions? I'm going to take a breath. Feel free if there's anything coming up. Okay, so should I take that to mean nobody has questions right now? Right? No questions right now. So I'll keep talking. Okay. Yes.
Eu acho would be great if you talk a little bit about how the program is structured, right? Because I feel that, for example, for me, it was take a while to understood how can I say that, the structure, because the structure of the program reflects the 3 waves, reflects all this movement inside the Buddhism and how it relates with psychology.
Wonderful.
So it would be nice to hear a little bit about you, like the first chapter of Advances in Contemplative Psychotherapy. When I read that, oh my God, now I understand how this program works, So
Right.
if you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. Thank you, Fernanda. Yes. Well, the way the program works is we try to give people a firm foundation in the ancient psychology, right, and the history of where the techniques come from, right? So one of the things we try to do is ground everyone in an understanding of the history of Buddhist psychology and, how the Buddhist tradition understands the mind and understands, the way that meditation helps transform the mind. We also relate, the traditional psychology with, modern psychology and psychotherapy. So you can think of the program as revolving around 3 basic disciplines, right? So there's in Buddhist psychology, self-healing requires us to understand insight or wisdom, right? We have to learn how to develop a kind of understanding of the mind and how it can suffer or how it can be healed. We need to learn meditation in a way that allows us to influence the way our brains work and the way our emotions and minds work so that we can really learn at a deeper level. We also need to understand what we call ethics, which is how it's important to to have good motivation, a caring motivation, to work with our minds so that we build on positive motivation, and also to learn in community and to create safe, healing communities in which we feel respected, we feel understood. So, in the contemplative psychotherapy program, we connect each of these ancient disciplines with modern disciplines, right? So, for example, we connect ancient Buddhist psychology with Western psychotherapy, right? We really feel that psychotherapy is in and of itself, is a very contemplative practice, and that if we really understand the way, the Buddhists view the mind, there's a tremendous rich dialogue with how modern psychotherapists view the mind and explore the mind. We learn how to understand the mind from the inside out, not the way our scientists do by looking at questionnaires or looking at brains. We're really using the inside out, the phenomenological or existential or experiential art of self inquiry to understand our own minds. In terms of meditation, we link meditation with neuroscience, right? Because we believe that we really need to understand, if we want to understand contemplative healing, we need to understand the power of contemplative practice to transform the way our minds and brains work, right? So there we link the discipline of meditation with the neuroscience that explains how meditation really works, right? Finally, we link ethics with understanding the importance of healthy relationship and healthy community, right? Understanding the importance of fair, equitable, loving, caring relationship and community, and trying to build that into our own learning communities at Nalanda Institute. So that's one way in which we understand the structure, is that within the program, we cover all these different disciplines, right? So we spend time going back through history and understanding the origins of Buddhist psychology so that you don't just learn how to meditate, you also learn the science, the psychology behind the meditation practice. We look at neuroscience and try to understand the mechanisms by which meditation transforms the brain, overrides stress, and allows us to tap into our potential for healing and transformation. And we also look at you know the social and communal dimension of healing in terms of creating a communal learning environment amongst ourselves and understanding the importance of engaging the world with a contemplative mindset. A lot of people, I think Ale was sharing how much political unrest there is in Brazil these days. And often one of the things that happens in those environments is that we all become very triggered by how much suffering there is in the world, or how much violence or oppression, and this can really consume us. So it's really one of the really important things about contemplative practice is learning to bring this powerful art and science of protecting the mind and transforming the mind so that we're more able to bear the suffering of our clients and the suffering of the world around us, and stay well and stay healthy and don't get consumed or triggered by all the suffering we're facing. So the program works through having a set of different disciplines that that each complement each other, and some of the disciplines come from ancient contemplative science and practice, some from modern psychological and social healing practice and neuroscience, but we bring them together into this interdisciplinary whole, this kind of interdisciplinary curriculum that allows people to really understand at a very deep level how these practices how they work, and to experience them right for ourselves, and to share the experience with the others in our community. So I think the other thing, the way the program is structured in a day-to-day way, is that we each week we have another lecture that has been video taped in usually in the New York program, and that is that there's a written translation for the lecture, and then every other week. So that's over the course of the year, 30 lectures. And some of the lectures are in Buddhist psychology, some of them are in neuroscience, some of them are in clinical application, how people have tried to apply mindfulness or compassion in psychotherapy. Some of them are in ethics or social justice, social equity learning. And these basically we cover all these disciplines through these weekly lectures, and then every other week we gather in a live Zoom like this, and we really just meditate together and talk about our understanding, right? So that's the live learning part of the curriculum, is in our twice monthly gatherings where we meditate together, we talk about patients or clients or the challenges we're facing, and we also talk about our meditative experiences. People obviously need to be practicing meditation on a daily basis, because this isn't just a intellectual learning. We're really trying to learn at the deepest levels of our mind and nervous system. And so we encourage you to practice daily the meditations that we're focusing on every week, and also to teach your peers so that you get comfortable teaching meditation to others, right? So this is extremely important if you want to learn to teach your clients or whatever, whether you're a therapist or you're another kind of caregiver or a teacher or a minister or whatever, an activist. You're going to want to learn how to teach meditation as part of that. And of course, there's also what we call a final capstone project, which is a project that you work on all year that's helping you start to think about how you really want to practically apply what we're learning, right? So, essentially, this is a process that really takes people through a journey of self-discovery, a journey of sharing with others, a journey of meditative experience, and it's really a journey of transformation, because the people that go through our program, and some of you are here, right? So I recognize some faces from last year, really go through a deep personal experience in encountering these practices. So, I mean, that just gives you a flavor for how the program works. I'm happy to circle back and talk a little bit more about specifically the science of compassion, and how how we really try to teach how compassion practice is really proving to be a very, very powerful, pivotal, a method of healing and transformation, but also kind of a little bit more about how we actually teach compassion practice. So I don't know if there are other questions. Fernando, do you have any reflections you want to share about? Is there anything else you feel you want me to address? You're muted, Fernando, so I can't hear you.
No, that's great. Was wonderful listening you to give that overview, because as a student, I think take a while to understand this panorama, this landscape.
Yes.
So it's very useful to listen this beforehand.
Yeah. No, it's a lot. I mean, one of the things very often in modern, mindfulness based or other sort of meditative approaches to psychotherapy, we often think of, we understand that in the West, there's many different kinds of psychotherapy. And we understand that psychotherapy is a big field with all different kinds of philosophies and approaches. But we tend to think that mindfulness is just one thing, right? And the reality is that they've been studying the mind for 2,500 years, right? So if you think Western psychology is complicated or rich or varied, you really, there's a big surprise in store, because you'll see the richness and the complexity of the contemplative tradition that grew out of India and Tibet. And in particular, we understand that just as in the West we have therapies that are more cognitively based or insight based, we have therapies that are more relationally based or heart based, and we have therapies that are more about the body, right? Like Reichian therapies, Jungian therapies, breath practices, and so on, movement therapies. So too in the Indic tradition and contemplative psychology, there's this whole range of different psychologies. But the way that the tradition that developed at Nalanda, and this is the reason why we call Nalanda Institute by that name, is that Nalanda was the name of the world's first university, right? It's a university that started way before the universities in the West, sometime in the 2nd century of this era. And it was a Buddhist university, but like our modern universities, it was open to people from all different traditions. But the unique thing about the Nalanda tradition, about the Nalanda University, is that it began to systematize or develop a science of contemplative healing. In fact, it was one of the first medical schools in the ancient world, and taught psychology and other practices a long time ago. So one of the unique things about the Nalanda curriculum, since Nalanda was, as a university, existed for over 1,000 years, is that the curriculum has this complete record of all these different psychologies and practices that developed over many thousands of years, right? And over many centuries. And as all of those developed, what happened essentially in the 12th or 13th century is that they were all imported systematically into Tibet, so that a lot of this, I guess, millennium or more of psychological learning, of learning how to apply contemplative practice, how to make a science of contemplation, and how to make an art of healing that's based on meditation, and taking all of that and bringing it into the Tibetan universities or Tibetan monasteries, allowed those ancient traditions to be preserved, right? So that because of the isolation of Tibet, these practices that were preserved in the Tibetan world, many of the texts, for example, that were originally written were lost. as many, only about 10% of the texts that are understood and used in the Tibetan in the Tibetan curriculum still exist in the original languages. So the Nalanda tradition, the tradition that started at Nalanda University in India and then moved into Tibet, is the most comprehensive tradition of all of the ancient Buddhist traditions, and it brings together many of the practices that we now we learned about from different civilizations, right? So we learned about mindfulness from South India, from Burma and Sri Lanka. We learned about compassion training and the wisdom, the non-duality from Zen and in Japan. And we've learned something perhaps about embodied or tantric or esoteric psychology from understanding the Buddhism of Nepal and Tibet and Mongolia. But the Nalanda tradition preserves all of these in one curriculum. And so in a way, it's kind of like a central clearinghouse, or everything you need to know about contemplative learning is in this curriculum that we teach at Nalanda Institute. And that's the reason why we use that, we carry that name over, because we teach in this way that's comprehensive and systematic. One step at a time, we understand one piece about the practice, and then a little bit at a time, we move on to the next. So, again, I'm happy to say a little bit more about compassion, since this is the compassion year, but I'm also, since it's 7:20 or whatever, I'm also open to any questions you have. I'd like to know how you're thinking and anything you'd like to hear me talk about, so I'm not just talking.
Wonderful, Joe. Thank you. There is some questions on the
Great.
chat box. Are you doing Portuguese, right? And I think you need to change the channel.
Okay. So, all right, I'll go to the English channel.
Yeah.
I am. Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay.
Is this Yara or Doris? Okay,
I
Doris,
don't
thank
know.
you.
Você está ouvindo? Sim? Então, tem uma pergunta da Andrea, e ela pergunta o seguinte: esse assunto é muito novo para mim, então eu gostaria de uma explicação de como acontece a sessão de terapia. Como o psicólogo realiza sua intervenção no contexto terapêutico com o paciente?
Sim.
Okay, wow, that's a great question. So should I answer?
Acho que só ele escuta.
Should I answer on this channel, or should I go back to the other channel?
I think it would be better if you change.
Okay, all right. Okay, so that's a terrific question. And basically, there's many different ways that meditation, whether it's mindfulness or compassion meditation, can be brought into a psychotherapy session. Some therapists start the session with a meditation practice to help the client clear the mind and get calm and grounded, so that it's easier to process emotions and insights. Some therapists suggest that their clients learn how to meditate outside the individual session in groups, right? And they learn the skill of meditation in groups, and then together with the therapist, they explore how to use the meditation practice to accelerate their healing and their transformation. And there are also some forms of contemplative psychotherapy that are group based, like dialectical behavior therapy and so on. So one of the things we do in the contemplative psychotherapy program is we don't just teach one way, right? We teach the basic foundation. It's sort of like you're going back to graduate school or back to university, to college. you're understanding the basic science of meditation, the basic neuroscience of meditation, the basic psychology of meditative healing and transformation. And then we also teach the different kinds of methodologies that have been developed in the West to apply meditation. So we'll teach you a little bit about mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. How does that work? We'll teach you about compassion and intersubjective psychoanalysis or intersubjective psychotherapy. We'll teach you about compassion and embodied meditative methods like somatic experiencing. So we explore and we touch on all of the different Western methods that are being developed to use contemplative practice with clients in many different ways, right? So you're really going to get a wide, not just one method or one tool, but a whole tool chest of different methods you can decide which work best for you and your clients, and then go deeper with each of those because you have the foundation. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay. Were there other questions?
Yeah, in Portuguese again.
Okay.
É uma pergunta da Viviane Barcelos. É preciso ter formação em psicologia ou já ser praticante de mindfulness para essa formação, né, para o curso de psicoterapia contemplativa?
Okay, great question. Thank you. All right, so because, basically what we've learned in the last 20 to 30 years is that stress may be one of the critical causes of many different kinds of suffering and illness, right? It may be a cause of mental problems like anxiety and depression. It's certainly a cause of trauma and addiction, but also stress impacts the body. It impacts our physical health and well-being. It impacts our relationships. And because meditative healing reduces stress and protects the mind from living in what we call survival mode, and allows our minds and our brains to shift out of the stress-based survival processing and into thriving, into the healing-based, the well-being-based, thriving systems within our minds and bodies. This contemplative healing methods really can be applied in almost any kind of way of working with people. We can apply it in business. If we're consultants, we can apply it if we're medical doctors or alternative medicine doctors, if we're teachers, if we're ministers, because anytime we're dealing with a person who is suffering because of stress and trauma, these methods can be helpful. So there's we typically we take people from many different backgrounds and professions, including therapy, family, social work, family work, couples work, but also it could be physical healing practices like alternative medicine. It could be medicine itself, integrative medicine. We work with teachers, we work with lawyers, we work with firemen. We work with business coaches and human resource consultants. So yes, we have a multidisciplinary program, although we focus on understanding the mind and the psychology of stress and how meditation helps transform stress into healing. So that's the core of what we focus on, but you can see it can be applied in many different ways of working.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Thank you.
Okay.
Another question in Portuguese. É uma pergunta do Alê. Como a psicoterapia contemplativa compreende a relação entre doença e cura? Vamos além da clássica representação psicanalítica dessa relação?
Oh, that's a beautiful question, Ali. Thank you so much for that. Okay. So, yeah, as Ali is suggesting, the basic approach to healing in the contemplative traditions is very different from the basic approach to healing in most modern psychotherapy. There is a fundamental assumption of well-being. There's a fundamental assumption that's, you'd have to say optimistic or hopeful or positive, that at the core of every human being, of every living being, there's a natural potential for healing and growth and transformation. And so the emphasis is less on the pathology, the illness and the suffering. We recognize the power of suffering. We recognize how much people suffer unnecessarily, but we really believe that the way to work with the suffering is not so much to fight it, but to rather help the person live with it, work with it, by accessing the deeper potential for healing and learning and transformation. So it's really a much more, you'd have to say, optimistic or positive transformational approach to healing, in which we often see the suffering that we have not as a curse or a lifelong genetic illness, but as a kind of potential opportunity to learn and heal, to learn how to live better, what we might be doing wrong that we could learn to undo, and what we can do, the new things we can learn to promote well-being and healing. So it's really more focused on the deep faith in human potential to learn how to be happy and to powerfully transform any kind of suffering, from the most simple anxiety and depression to the most ingrained and deep and powerful trauma. So yeah, thank you for that question, Ale. Any other thoughts or questions people have? We have some time left.
Yeah. There is a question in English.
Okay.
From Ivan Chagas, I think. Is the contemplative psychotherapy idea more close to Tibetan Buddhism ideas, or more close to of the secular Buddhism approach?
Okay, so in other words, is it more like a religious thing or more like a secular thing? Is that the question? Can you read it again, Fernanda?
Okay. Is the contemplative psychotherapy idea more close to the Tibetan Buddhism ideas, or more close of the secular Buddhism approach?
I see. Okay. Well, okay. So I'll just say that I'm not sure exactly what you mean by secular Buddhism, but I'm thinking what you're talking about is things like mindfulness and mindfulness-based stress reduction, approaches to Buddhist methods or practices that are based on science and don't necessarily require a person to become a Buddhist or to believe anything in particular. So, it's true that the Tibetan tradition seems a lot more religious than the secular mindfulness tradition, right? Because there's all the imagery, the sort of mythological imagery, the archetypal imagery, and the ritual, and so on. But within the heart of the Tibetan tradition, there is a scientific approach to healing that is the essence of both the medical model in the medical discipline in Tibetan culture, Tibetan medicine, Tibetan psychiatry, and even the approach of Tibetan spiritual practice is understood as, essentially a way to make accessible a fundamentally psychological and scientific process, right? A process that's not really mystical. It's not really about faith or God. It's really about the way the mind works. It's really about tapping into causality. So in other words, what I would say is, in the contemplative psychotherapy program, we follow the approach that people like John Kabat-Zinn and others have developed of explaining everything, the Buddhist psychology and meditation, in terms of science, in terms of Western science, and helping people understand the secular basis, the health, the psychology, and the well-being that is a result of these practices. At the same time, we are also looking at practices that are not just mindfulness. We're looking at practices that involve cultivating the heart. We're looking at practices that involve our ethical responsibility to others, compassion and altruism. And we're looking at practices like imagery, for example, that, or recitation that could seem religious. At Nalanda Institute, we're an educational institute. So everything we're teaching, we believe we have a scientific, psychological basis to teach it. And we believe that anyone can learn it without having to become a Buddhist or become religious or whatever. However, I would say we're teaching things that are, in a way, much more that will may feel more spiritual or even religious than just plain mindfulness. So I guess it's a very complicated question that you asked. It's a nuanced question, and I'm happy to, if you have a follow up, if I wasn't clear, please, feel free to come back to it. Well, I'll just say one more thing, Fernanda. This is one of the things about the Nalanda tradition that we chose to model. The essence of the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism is to explain all Buddhist theories and practices in terms of reason and evidence, right? In other words, we understand now, like we know all about, you've probably heard about Mind Life Institute and Richie Davidson and the Dalai Lama meeting with people. We know that the Dalai Lama is interested in science and meets with physicists and biologists and all these people. And we might think, well, he's just doing that to be nice, or maybe he wants to convert people. But the reality, he's doing it because he's not doing anything different from what the Buddha himself did. The Buddhism, from the very beginning, the Buddha said, take my words as a goldsmith buys gold. Don't take them on faith. Take them after you've examined them thoroughly by 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 cutting and rubbing, just like you would gold in a market. So the Socratic method, or the empirical method of science, has always been embedded in Buddhism as the primary method for learning. They don't believe that that it's helpful to just take things on faith unless we're also going to test them. We can take them on faith for a little while, but we need to test them. And we need to test them against reason, and we need to test them against evidence. And the Nalanda tradition specializes in taking all of the Buddhist culture, all the different practices, and presenting them in a critical, scientific, empirical framework that we believe is very helpful for Western students, right? Because we can learn about it. We don't have to change, we don't have to belong to another culture or subscribe to a different religion or different beliefs. We're just being challenged to think differently and try it out, to practice different things and see if they help. And so we teach in that way. In the Nalanda tradition, it's a fundamentally Socratic and empirical approach to learning.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay.
I don't
Any other
know.
questions or thoughts?
Se alguém quiser abrir o microfone e fazer alguma pergunta também, fiquem super à vontade. Yeah, I think we don't have any other question, Joe.
Ivan, were you trying to ask a question? You're muted.
I'm not sure. Okay, nothing. I'm just curious to know if there is any material about the contemplative psychotherapy in Portuguese or in English for initiantes, for basic kind of 101.
Right. Yes. Well, we have one of the things that we've done at Nalanda Institute is we've published a series of essays from our faculty. It's called Advances in Contemplative Psychotherapy. It has been translated into Spanish, and we're waiting to get it translated into Portuguese. I do believe that we've translated at least the introduction to that into Portuguese. Am I right about that, Fernanda?
Yeah.
So that may be something Fernanda can send out to all of you here.
Yeah.
To give you, there's the book. Ale is showing the cover of the book. But this is one of the problems that right now, I think this new field is new to the Portuguese language and it's new to Brazil. So there's less there's less material available in Portuguese than there is even in Spanish, and then much less than is available in English. So we're trying to bridge that gap and make more available, and we're doing some of the translations ourselves. Okay. So, but maybe you can, Fernando will send that chapter, and feel free to let me know if you have any questions. So maybe if there are no questions right now, we could spend a few minutes just talking about compassion training, because the heart of the new year that's coming, the compassion-based psychotherapy year, is really understanding the power of compassion to heal and transform our relationship with ourselves and the world. So, obviously, we're often taught that compassion is maybe an obligation, that we should be compassionate. Or some people believe, we're often taught that compassion is only, like, some people are more compassionate by nature than others. In general, I don't think we're taught that people can cultivate compassion, that we can learn how to be more compassionate or more wisely compassionate. but and even, of course, as I was taught when I went into medical school, if you're too compassionate, you're going to burn out. You should not be empathic because it'll just wear you down and burn you out. So there's a lot of myths about compassion. And one of the things that's very exciting is that following after the first wave of research on mindfulness and how it heals, there's been in recent, I guess, starting in 2008 or so, so in the last 12 years or so, 12 or 13 years, there's been increasing research on the importance of compassion and the power of compassion to transform the way the brain works. And this is extremely important because what it shows is very surprising given the way we're educated and our general beliefs or misconceptions about compassion. What it shows is that compassion is something that is actually relatively easy to train. So in groups of undergraduates, college students in the U.S., not necessarily the most compassionate people in the world, right? But what we discovered is that in just 6 to 8 weeks of training, the way their brains work when they see the suffering faces of others in pain is very different. So I'll try to explain what I mean. Normally, the first thing that happens when we see a person suffering, especially if we're untrained, if we're just not paying attention or are not very mindful about our response, is that we become triggered by the other person's suffering, right? Because there's mirror neurons that help us read the body language of others, the facial expressions. And if we see something that looks like suffering, it reminds us of states that we've experienced in the past, of pains that we've experienced. And this is why if someone's upset, our first reaction is to get upset ourselves. And psychologists generally call this social contagion, right? And this is the reason why we are prone to having burnout when we are around people who suffer a lot or around a lot of trauma. It's also the reason why when we watch the news and we see all the terrible things that are happening in the world around us, we feel unsafe and helpless and powerless. What this research showed is that circuit, the stress reactive circuit to suffering, can be modulated, and people can learn very quickly to shift out of a stress response or sympathetic distress when others are suffering, and instead learn to shift into what we call genuine compassion or wise compassion, where we don't actually feel that we're in danger. We don't feel somehow confused or threatened by the other person's suffering. Instead, we feel care for them, and we instantly feel connected to them in a place of love and care and concern, and even maybe an urge to be helpful. So when that kind of compassion happens, the first kind of compassion, the impact it has on the brain, the first kind of reaction, I'll just say, I won't call it compassion, I'll just say the first sympathetic distress reaction triggers the stress response. And the brain, the amygdala gets triggered, and we start to, if we see distress, we start to feel stressed. But with 6 to 8 weeks of compassion training, the brains of these undergraduates respond very differently. Instead of feeling distress and having amygdala activity or amygdala hijack, they go straight into what we call compassion satisfaction, which is the compassion network or empathy network in the emotional brain. Links our emotional capacity to care and respond to our intellectual capacity to think about how to help, and also links the brain to the internal reward system, the system in the brain that makes us feel well, satisfied, meaningful, helpful, right? So instead of reacting to suffering with stress and getting the amygdala triggered, these students' brains started reacting to suffering with real compassion, and they felt a sense of meaning, purpose, and well-being. And if you think about your role, whether you're a caregiver or whether you're a therapist or whether you're a parent or a teacher or an activist or whatever you are, think about if you could, every time you engage suffering, feel a deeper sense of meaning and purpose and joy. Think about how that would energize you and help protect you from the stresses of being around suffering, right? So this is the power of this is what I would call the compassion revolution. It's a whole new, very exciting field in science where we're understanding that compassion is like medicine. And that if we learn how to, and that we can also, it's like a muscle, we can cultivate it. And if we learn how to cultivate it, we can protect our own minds from the suffering of others, from being triggered by the suffering of others. And we also can access this huge reservoir of human kindness and compassion that empowers us to be, to feel better, to heal ourselves, and also to care more effectively for others. So I just wanted to share that plug for compassion and the plug for compassion training, which is the heart of what we teach in the compassion year. And, I do hope, thank you, Sandra Elena. I do hope that some of you will join us and take this journey together this year of practicing, the powerful arts of compassion. So I guess we have a few minutes left. I don't know if there are other questions either about that or the program or anything else, but I'm happy to respond or just hear. How's everybody doing? We've made you've hung in this far for it's late at night. I'm sure everybody's hungry. Okay, well, I just want to thank Fernanda and Ale for organizing this, and thank all of you for joining us and for sharing your time with us. And thank you, Mar, for connecting with so many of our students and people interested. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to Mar. And of course, you can also, or Fernanda, and of course, you can also reach out to me, and I can use Google Translator to try to translate, or I can ask for help from Doris or Yara or Fernanda.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe. It was wonderful. Thank you, Yara, Doris, Ale, todo mundo que esteve aqui hoje. Muito obrigada. Espero que a gente possa continuar conectados, aprendendo psicoterapia contemplativa. Muito obrigada. Obrigada, Mar, por todo apoio, por toda a Mar, ela tem sido nosso porto seguro, assim, é quem a gente recorre para nos ajudar. I was thanking Mar that's helping so much Portuguese students,
Obrigado, Joy, pela magnífica aula, e mande um abraço aqui do povo brasileiro, dos estudantes brasileiros para a tua comunidade, para a nossa comunidade, né?
Oh, thank
enfim,
you.
e para o staff do
Back to
Instituto.
you.
Muito obrigado. Obrigado a todos. Obrigado, Mar.
Obrigadão, gente. Um beijo. Em breve a gente manda a gravação e
Obrigado.
o texto também. Beijo grande. Obrigada.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.